Welcome everybody to another episode of The State of, the series where we go over a console's current emulation state. On today's episode, we'll be covering the Nintendo DS. This console had various iterations that each sought to improve on one another. The first of these is the original DS, or the Phat DS as it's commonly called. It was released on November 21st, 2004 in North America, and would eventually become the successor to the Game Boy Advance systems. Because of this, it shared a lot in common with its predecessor, having the same clamshell design, clicky buttons, charging port, Nintendo logo, and the ability to play GBA games. I mean, it pretty much is a Game Boy Advance. The console's name, DS, stands for dual screen and is referring to the main gimmick of this system. It had two 4x3 screens with a resolution of 256 by 192 pixels each. Both screens were backlit and allowed you to play in the dark, but were a significant downgrade over the AGS 101's very bright screen. The bottom screen here was a resistive touchscreen and included a stylus for you to interact with it. You also got two speakers, which meant that stereo sound was possible for the first time on a Nintendo handheld. And by the way, these speakers are great, they're super loud. Lastly, a headphone jack and microphone were available. Some games took advantage of this microphone and forced you to blow into it for gameplay, but it was always super annoying to be honest. Upon powering the console, you were booted into a home menu where you could do things other than play your game. This was a revolutionary feature at the time, as no previous Nintendo handheld had a home menu. You could do things like boot into your game, adjust the brightness, set the date and time, enter PictoChat, enter download play, or even set an alarm. In terms of brightness control, you only had two options, backlight on or backlight off. Another revolutionary feature was that of wireless connectivity. This meant that you didn't have to connect the wire between two systems to play together, and a lot of systems allowed you to play multiplayer so long as at least one of your friends owned a copy. Wireless connectivity was also used for the new PictoChat application, which allowed you to join chat rooms and talk with friends. You could type out messages to them or draw images and send them. And if you were someone who used this application, you probably have some fond memories of sending great art to your friends. Looking at this console today, it's surprising how playable it still is. I feel like the games look less pixely here too, and it's probably due to how dim the screen is. I managed to find one on Mercari for only $15, which is great considering you get access to both DS and GBA games. In 2006, Nintendo made a redesign of the original DS in the form of the DS Lite. This console is significantly smaller than its predecessor and also looks way better. It retains most of the features of the original DS, with the exception of the Nintendo logo not being on top anymore and a different charging port. The buttons here are much squishier and a lot less clicky, and we now get a power slider instead of a power button. GBA games are still playable, but now they horribly stick out of the bottom of the DS. A good upgrade here is the stylus, which now comes out of the side of the console and feels less cheap than the previous one. The biggest upgrade though has to be the screens, as they're way brighter now and it's clearer to make out what's going on. In terms of software, everything here is identical to the Phat DS, with the one exception that you can flip through 4 brightness levels rather than 2. I find that most people hold the DS Lite in the highest regard, and I think it's due to it maintaining the Game Boy Advance slot and having excellent screens. These consoles sold impeccably well, so finding one today for cheap isn't too difficult, although they are more expensive than the Phat DS's. The third iteration of the DS, the DSi, made the most changes to the line of consoles and was released in 2009. This system is a bit slimmer and slightly longer than the DS Lite. It also featured a classy matte finish, but the GBA slot was removed, so we lost the ability to play these games. The buttons here are a middle ground between DS Lite squishiness and Phat DS clickiness. You'll also find the power button is back, and the volume slider is replaced with volume buttons. The sound here is better too, as these speakers get noticeably louder than the DS Lite speakers. New introductions to this console though were its front and rear facing cameras, which have an astonishing 0.3 megapixel quality. This means that the camera I'm recording on now is 40 times better. Lastly, the console has more RAM and a faster processor than the DS Lite, and this was taken advantage of in the exclusive titles that the DSi featured. On the software side of things, you'll find that the DS menu has been completely redesigned. We now have a string of icons that can be scrolled through with the left and right D-pad buttons, or also the stylus. PictoChat, Download Play, and Settings each get their own icon, and there's also one for the game you insert. You'll even notice that the system can now read games while powered on, which was not possible before. There are new icons here too for your sound, camera, and shop applications. Inside the camera app, you can view and also edit your photos, and there's a bunch of effects you can apply to them. Similar to this, we also have the Nintendo Sound application, which could be used to record and edit audio clips. I mean, not professionally, of course. It was more of a mess around thing for kids to play with the speed and pitch of their voice. We also, for the first time, had an online shop that allowed you to download what Nintendo called DSiWare titles. These were games that were exclusive to the DSi and relied on its camera for gameplay. You unfortunately can't download them anymore, as the shop has long since been closed, but later I'll talk about other ways that you can access them. One of the most cherished of these titles though is that of Flipnote Studio, which allows you to make Flipnote animations. It's still fun to come back to considering how simple and easy it is to learn. When the DSi first came out, it was seen as a worthwhile improvement to the DS Lite, and many, including me at the time, thought it to be the superior of the two consoles. I was a kid and found all of the DSi's applications to be pretty fun to mess around with. Nowadays though, you do have to consider its major limitation in that it doesn't have a GBA slot. Despite this, I still prefer the DSi, as I think it has the best and most responsive buttons. And I also don't find myself playing Game Boy games on a DS too often. In terms of price, it's between the Phat DS and DS Lite, so not too bad. Definitely get your hands on one if you can. Okay, let's get into how we can emulate this console. And believe me when I say this is a tough console to emulate, but I still think it's worth doing. We'll begin with the PC side of things, and then move towards some other methods that you may have not even thought possible. First up is the Melon DS standalone emulator, which most people seem to like for its great compatibility and performance. The best way to play DS games here will be to connect the controller and then use the mouse for the touchscreen. Doing a left click on the mouse here is equivalent to tapping the touchscreen with the DS stylus. It works pretty well and kind of has a computer flash game feel. Here I have to mention WarioWare Touched. This is as flash game as it gets and is entirely controllable using the mouse. Although a mouse isn't really perfect in every scenario, as I'm not the biggest fan of it in games like Phantom Hourglass and Metroid Prime Hunters. If you happen to have a computer with a touchscreen, then this would be a lot better, as many of those devices come with a stylus. Melon DS also isn't great if you're trying to play on a TV, as it doesn't let you map touchscreen functionality to a controller. If the game you're playing doesn't require the touchscreen, then you'll be fine. But if it does, you're going to have to get up to mess with your computer every time you need to use the touchscreen. When emulating these games, you'll also have to deal with the prospect of laying out two screens on a device that only has one. This is probably the biggest hurdle in emulating DS games, and Melon DS gives you a lot of options here. An absolute necessity for me is also being able to enter a full screen mode where you can only see the two DS screens, and thankfully Melon DS has you covered with this. In terms of layouts, we first have the classic vertical layout, which places one screen on top of the other and feels closest to an actual DS. The biggest downside with this layout though is that the screens don't take up a lot of your monitor space, as we have giant black bars on the left and right. Despite this, it's still my favorite layout when I'm sitting right in front of my computer, and for games like Yoshi's Island DS, Tetris DS, Contra 4, and WarioWare Touched, it's a must. When using a vertical layout though, an important thing here is to have the option to adjust the screen gap. It's important because the DS top screen isn't directly on top of the bottom one. There is a sizable gap between them. and if you choose to omit this gap, the whole thing can look a bit funny in some games. Thankfully, Melon DS does let you space out these screens, although I feel the options here are a bit limited. Like from an 8 pixel gap, it goes straight to 64. This isn't ideal because the perfect gap for me is somewhere between this. I'd say in the 30 to 45 range. The horizontal layout places the two screens side by side, and we can also adjust the screen gap, but it doesn't matter to me as much here. The biggest advantage with this one is that you get bigger screens that take up more monitor space. Lastly, we have the hybrid mode, which combines both vertical and horizontal layouts and is very jarring to my eyes. Now all of these layouts can be used in tandem with the screen sizing settings. These are settings that allow you to emphasize one of the two screens. They work great in a horizontal layout as the entire look is a lot more pleasing to the eye. Another option here is to show only one screen at a time, which can make DS games feel more natural on a single display. It works great in Pokemon games, given that you can assign a button to switch between screens. The last option here is to force integer scaling. Now in my last video, I talked about integer scaling and how it's the way to go for most retro games. I don't however feel that it's necessary for most DS games and tend to keep it turned off. For one, DS games started to introduce 3D models and rely less on pixel art graphics. These models don't need to be integer scaled and look fine with Melon DS's default scaling method. I also don't turn it on because it significantly reduces the size of the screens. Another very important setting here is that of screen rotation, as certain DS titles required you to flip the console 90 degrees. Games like Style Savvy, Fritz Chess, Brain Age, Planet Puzzle League, and Rhythm Heaven. So it's essential for an emulator to also allow you to do this. And thankfully Melon DS has you completely covered here, as you can rotate the screen 90 degrees in any direction. Lastly, we have aspect ratio settings, and these allow you to adjust each screen individually. I would suggest keeping them both at 4:3, as that's the original DS aspect ratio. Although one really weird thing you can do is set the top screen to top window and the bottom screen to bottom window to really stretch both screens. I suppose this is here to give you more screen real estate, but it just looks so strange. Over in the video settings, we have the awesome feature of being able to upscale these games to higher resolutions. This can make DS games look stunning. I mean, Mario Kart here doesn't even look like a DS game anymore. We can also make New Super Mario Bros. Look like New Super Mario Bros. It's actually crazy the amount of detail these models had that the DS's native resolution just wasn't able to capture. One thing you should know though is that only 3D models will be upscaled, so anything that was pixel art before will stay pixelated. This gives the game a hybrid look where certain elements are upscaled highly while others remain pixelated. I think it looks fine to be honest, but I could see some people hating this look, as it is kind of strange to have high resolution 3D models next to pixelated sprites. Now if you know anything about emulating games, you'll know that one of the most crucial things is hotkeys. Hotkeys are shortcut keys that you press to access an emulator's extra features, like save states and fast forward toggle. The best emulators in my opinion should allow you to fully map hotkeys to your controller and keyboard. Where many, and I mean many emulators typically fall short though, is in not allowing you to map hotkeys to your controller and only letting you map them to your keyboard. Melon DS doesn't really have too many hotkeys, but the most useful ones here are fast forward, toggle full screen, pause, and swap screens. You can thankfully map all of them to your controller, but I'm not the biggest fan of how you have to hold the button to fast forward rather than toggling it on. Another downside here is that there are no hotkeys for things like save states and swapping screen layouts. What you do get, however, are keyboard shortcut keys for your save states, but these shortcut keys can't be mapped to your controller. One of the coolest things that this emulator lets you do though is boot into both the DS home menu and DSi home menu. To do this, you'll need to provide several of the DS's BIOS files, which can be dumped from your console or found on the internet. It's really up to you. I think you can guess how I got them. Once you have your BIOS files though, you can go to Config, EMU Settings, and then in DS mode, you add your original DS BIOS files. While in DSi mode, you can add your DSi BIOS files. After doing this, you can go back to General and decide whether you want to boot in DS mode or DSi mode. Finally, go to File and click Boot Firmware to get started. Starting with DS mode, you'll see that we get the classic DS and DS Lite home menu. PictoChat and DS Download Play are fully bootable here and work the same as they would on an original DS. The system settings are also accessible, but the brightness button doesn't do anything. Under the file settings, you can also choose to insert a cart that can then be booted from the menu. Now the much more impressive feature is the DSi mode, which is exclusive to Melon DS. It is however quite limited and yet to have all of the functionality of the DSi. The most important icons are here however: the system settings, camera, sound app, and even Flipnote Studio. Not all of these icons are functional though, as the Nintendo DSi sound application merely boots into a white screen. The DSi camera application does work perfectly and allows you to use your webcam in place of the DSi camera. It even pixelates the camera quality to mirror the DSi's. You can also mess around with all of the effects and really make yourself look like a crackhead. When it comes to DSiWare applications, the most revered of these tends to be Flipnote Studio, and I'm happy to say that the entire functionality of it is available here. It's great for someone who just casually wants to make a flipbook and doesn't really need the power of some crazy desktop application. I generally find it a great thing that you're able to emulate the entire DSi menu. While it's not perfect yet, you can still get a great insight on what it was like to have a DSi. Overall, Melon DS is a great way to emulate games. All of the settings are really easy to access and understand. I would say it's a good program for someone who's new to the whole emulating scene. Although it's not the simplest emulator you can get, and we'll see about that later. This might also be the emulator to use if you're on lower end hardware, given that the performance is really well optimized. The only downside for me is the inability to map a lot of the emulator's functionality to a controller. First of all, why the hell did they have to call it this? Desmume. And I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, because in my last video, I couldn't pronounce Gambate to save my life. I kept saying Gambit. Anyways, I found this emulator to be a lot less intuitive than Melon DS. It seems like it's packaged more towards people who know what they're doing, rather than complete beginners. That's not to say that you can't find your way around it though, just that some of the settings are a bit more hidden. Let's start here again with screen layouts, and you'll quickly realize that Desmume has all of the same layouts that Melon DS has. When in a horizontal layout, it also gives you a lot more control over the sizing of each individual screen. There are many different ratios here, and I find this to be a good setting to really dial in the screens to the size I want them to be. Although the screen gap settings are even more limited here for some reason. You'd think this would be an easy fix. The screen rotation settings are here too, and pretty much the same as Melon DS. Initially, I thought there wasn't a full screen feature, but I later found out that you need to press Alt and Enter to go into it. Now even when I did this, I saw that the toolbar on top was still there, so I was asking myself, is this even a full screen mode? Well, turns out you can disable the toolbar by going to View and then deselecting Show Toolbar. But this is what I'm talking about when I say Desmume isn't very intuitive. And this continues in its upscaling settings, as they were hard to locate. You can usually find them in the video settings, but Desmume doesn't have any. What you actually need to do is go to the 3D settings. You'll need to switch 3D rendering engine to OpenGL 3.2. Then you can increase the GPU scaling factor to upscale 3D models in DS games. The higher this number, the more strain the emulator will put on your machine. I found that going up to 3 results in some pretty sharp 3D models, but you can go crazy if you want. My system only starts chugging when I get up to 8 on the GPU scale factor, but I honestly can't notice much of a difference between 8 and 3. They both look pretty sharp to me. Now lastly, if for some reason you don't see the GPU scaling factor setting, then that means you're probably on an older version of Desmume, which is exactly what happened to me, so make sure you're fully up to date. Next up, let's take a look at the control side of things here. You'll find that everything is pretty much the same as Melon DS, and that you can map the DS's buttons to your controller, and you can use the mouse to replicate interacting with the touchscreen. There also isn't any way to map the touchscreen's functionality to your controller, so again, playing on a TV isn't ideal. Hotkeys, on the other hand, are mappable to your controller, and that's the truly great thing about Desmume. And I'm talking every single hotkey here. Fast forward is much better too, because you can toggle it on rather than having to hold the button to do it. There's even a hotkey that lets you switch between screen layouts. So if you're in a vertical layout, you can switch to a horizontal with the click of a button. This one is a must, and it's actually surprising that Melon DS doesn't have it. You can also emulate the DS menu, and it works just as well here. What you can do, however, is emulate the DSi menu, so Melon DS comes out on top in this area. Overall, I tend to prefer Desmume despite its learning curve. It just feels like the more mature and aged emulator because of the superior settings that it has for stuff like screen layouts, hotkeys, and even video settings. Now we get into what seems to be the most despised way to emulate games: Retroarch. Now I know a lot of the Retroarch haters are going to leave their comment telling me how awful it is, but for DS emulation, it actually has some great features that you won't get in a standalone emulator. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's better, but just that it offers a different experience. For starters, you'll need to pick a core to use, and I'd recommend using the Melon DS core. A core is just a built-in emulator in Retroarch, and you'll find multiple for any given system. Now, Retroarch's best feature is that it allows you to finally map your controller to interact with the DS touchscreen. Yes, the one thing that standalone emulators can't do, Retroarch can. To do this, you'll first need to open up the quick menu, go to Core Options, Screen, and under Touch Mode, select Joystick. Then go into the controller settings and map your right analog stick to the touch joystick settings. This will create a cursor on your screen that can be controlled with your right analog stick. You'll also need to map a button on your controller to interact with the touchscreen. I have this set to L2 on my controller, so whenever I press L2, the simulated DS touchscreen will detect touch. Now, is this better than using a mouse? Well, no, it's not as accurate as the mouse, and you wouldn't want to play a touch-based game that requires a high level of precision, but it gets the job done and makes emulating the DS on a TV actually possible. It's just crazy to me that standalone emulators don't have this feature. Now, another cool thing that you can do with this is make a game like Metroid Prime Hunters into a twin-stick shooter. The only caveat is that you have to hold down L2 to aim, but it still feels fine to me. Also, if you plan to do this, be sure to decrease your analog dead zone to 0, and you might also have to adjust the sensitivity, so be sure to mess around with that. Now, setting your dead zone to 0 might make some DS games feel weird, which brings me to the other advantage that Retroarch has over the standalone emulators: the fact that it lets you have unique settings for different games or cores. So if I want my dead zone to be 0 in Metroid Prime Hunters, while having it be normal in every other game, I can definitely do that. Or maybe I want a game like Mario Kart DS to boot into a horizontal layout, while wanting a game like Tetris DS to boot into a vertical layout. To do this, first boot into a DS game, then adjust your settings to the way you want them, and this applies for any Retroarch settings, not just the ones in the quick menu. After this, go into the quick menu, select Overrides, and then click Save Game Overrides. This will apply the settings you currently have to only the game that's loaded. And if you want your settings to apply to every DS game, then hit Save Core Overrides. In terms of other settings, all of the screen layouts that the standalone Melon DS has are also here, except that you can get way better screen gap settings. You can finally have screen gaps in a very wide range. It's kind of weird considering this is the Melon DS core, so it should be the same as the standalone emulator, but I guess not. Upscaling is possible as well, but expect worse performance here, as is typical with Retroarch. One big downside though is that you can't rotate your screen, so that's definitely going to make a good amount of games completely unplayable. Overall, Retroarch is the definitive option if you really want to play DS games on the TV. Not only is every setting in Retroarch accessible with the controller, but you can also interact with the touchscreen using your right analog stick. It has great features that standalone emulators still lack for some reason, such as full controller support and having individual settings for each game. It does seem a bit more complicated than standalone emulators, but it's still a great option. Now, emulating DS games on a PC is great, but it's not the only way to emulate them. Nintendo actually implemented DS emulation into their Wii U console. The way it worked was you were able to download a select amount of DS games from the Wii U shop. Fast forward to today though, and the eShop has now closed, so there's no way to access these titles anymore. Or is there? Well, if you jailbreak your Wii U, you can still download the whopping 31 DS games that were available on the Wii U store. Yep, only 31. Now doing this isn't exactly legal, so I'm not going to give you guys a tutorial, but if you're interested, then I suggest you look up USB helper. Okay, but 31 isn't really a lot. Is there any way to play all the other DS titles? Yeah, there is actually, and to do this, you're going to need to make injections of games. I'll link a video in the description that goes over this process. It's kinda tedious to be honest, given that you have to title the games yourself and even provide a thumbnail picture. Compatibility isn't great here either, as there are many games that don't boot at all, or other games like Coraline that are completely unplayable due to graphical glitches. So that's the biggest disclaimer I'll give you about the Wii U, the fact that compatibility is really bad. Melon DS can play far more games than the Wii U, and that's probably why only 31 games were released for it. Okay, so getting that out of the way, what is the actual user experience like here? Well, you definitely don't get as many options as you do on the standalone emulators, but there are some unique and interesting ones here. Let's look at the screen layouts for example. Most of the usual suspects are here, along with stuff like this overlay that shows the original Phat DS. This layout scales the screen pretty nicely, but is honestly too small to play on the gamepad with. Now if you put it on the TV, you get the full picture of the DS, but it's honestly still kind of strange to play on. Another cool option here though, is the one that lets you see your bottom screen on the gamepad while having your top screen on the TV. I just think this is cool because it more closely replicates the DS's dual screens. The biggest downside with this though, is just how awful the low resolution looks when blown up on a giant widescreen TV. And my TV isn't even that big, it's only 43 inches. When just playing on the gamepad though, DS games look fine to me. Although some more 3D based games like Metroid Prime Hunters do suffer. There is a screen smoothing feature here though that just blurs everything and makes games look slightly less pixely. But now it just looks like a crappy YouTube recording of a DS game. The Wii U, unlike its standalone emulator counterparts, does not let you upscale DS games, meaning you're stuck with them at their original resolution. It's not the biggest deal as long as you don't plan to play these games on the TV. Another feature that's kind of limited here too is that of save states, as you can only have one save state per game. They also take really long to make, and it's kind of a pain. A more redeeming feature, however, is that you can pull up the manual of any DS game you're playing. Well, as long as it's one of those original 31 games that were released on the Wii U. This won't work with any injection you create of games. In theory, the Wii U should be a great way to emulate DS games, given that it's another DS console and has a lot in common with the DS. Things like its identical face buttons and resistive touchscreen. But there's just so many negatives to consider here. Not only the poor compatibility I previously mentioned, but also just how slow this console is. It feels really dated and past its time in this regard. Overall, I think that if you have a Wii U, then you should try this out, but I wouldn't go out and buy one just to emulate DS games. Let's talk about another console released by Nintendo, one that does a much better job of playing DS games. I'm talking of course about the Nintendo 3DS, another dual screen console. Now before you go and leave an angry comment, I am aware that the 3DS doesn't emulate DS games. Rather, it has the ability to play them natively. You can grab a DS game cartridge and insert it into a 3DS and play. So then what's the point of bringing it up here? It's pretty much the same thing as if you had a DS. Well, if you jailbreak your 3DS, you can, in the same sense as an emulator, load up DS ROMs and play them. Now if you do plan to go down this route, I do recommend that you go on the 3DS Hacks website and follow one of their written guides, as on that website you can quite literally input the model and software version of your 3DS and get a guide that's specifically tethered to that console. You don't want to go around messing with video guides for this, given that it's an easy way to break your console. Anyways, once you have your jailbroken 3DS, you can transfer your DS ROMs to your console's SD card and play them from there. It's even possible to create icons for each of your DS ROMs. You can follow a guide to do this, and I'll leave a link in the description to a video by Retro Gamecore that shows you how to do just this. Okay, so now that we have our DS ROMs on our 3DS, what is the actual player experience like? Well, you could consider this the best way to play DS games without having an actual DS. But there is one minor quirk here that sets it back in my opinion, the scaling. While the original DS had two 4x3 screens, the 3DS has a 5x3 top screen and a 4x3 bottom screen. Despite its bottom screen being 4x3, The DS still doesn't scale perfectly due to the different resolution. You get something that's in between a 1x and 2x scale. This creates a slightly blurry image that in all honesty isn't that noticeable, but it's still enough to bug me. The image just kind of feels soft in a way and sort of like a lower quality recreation of the DS. Now you do have the option to do a 1x scale of the image, which will reduce the amount of screen space you get, but looks insanely good. To do this, you simply need to hold the select button while booting into a DS game. You can very clearly see the difference between the two images by looking at this text in Tetris DS. Under the standard scaling mode, the text looks like it has a sort of shadowy after image next to it, while under the 1x perfect pixel scale, it looks nice and crisp. The only thing that bugs me is that the image isn't centered vertically and it just looks kind of weird. Regardless, this might be the best looking DS image you can get. The display also has this nice little horizontal scanline effect, which looks awesome. Obviously, for most people, the biggest downside is that they won't get as much screen real estate. I have the smaller of the two new Nintendo 3DSs and still find the image to be big enough for my eyes, but I imagine if you have the XL version of this console, then the image is at a much better size. By the way, if you're in the market to buy one of these Nintendo 3DSs, I'd recommend getting a Japanese one as they are cheaper. Although keep in mind that they're region locked, but jailbreaking them can get rid of this lock. Other than this whole scaling business though, the user experience here is honestly great, given that you get two screens and identical face buttons to the DS. The screens here are arguably better too, because they don't suffer from the same degree of motion blur or ghosting that the DS screens do. Another totally awesome feature here is the multiplayer. You can connect with other 3DS and even DS consoles and play with them. And if you're a fan of DSiWare, then with a jailbroken 3DS, you're able to access all of these titles. There's this homebrew application called the H-Shop that has what I'll call backups of certain Nintendo titles. Available here are all of the DSiWare games that were once available on the DSi shop. Now most of these games are not great, but some, like Shantae, Risky's Revenge, are still worth playing today. Overall, if you can get past the minor scaling issue, this might be the definitive way to store and play your DS ROMs. Now we've covered DS emulation on PCs, DS emulation on Nintendo consoles, but how about emulation on iOS devices? This is a method that was only available as of about a month ago. As many of you know, Apple is a company that has never been too fond of emulators, or any other cool shit like that. Apple just doesn't like cool shit. But as of April 2024, they finally allowed emulators on the App Store. This is absolute insanity considering Apple's business model of being as limited as possible. Out of the applications released so far, Delta has gotten a lot of traction, and that's because it's a pretty neat app that lets you emulate multiple consoles, including of course the Nintendo DS. And believe me when I tell you this, there's actually a lot of appeal in emulating these games on your iOS devices. So Delta has actually been around for a while, but prior to April 24, you either had to sideload it or jailbreak your device to get it. So what's the experience here like? Well, pretty good actually. I've so far had no hiccups in any of the games I've tested. Even on my old iPhone XR, which is a device from 2018. Although keep in mind, a lot of the footage you're seeing here I recorded on an iPhone 12. I do have to mention though that this emulator is missing a lot of the key features you get elsewhere. For starters, you're forced to annoyingly provide 3 different BIOS files to even be able to play DS games. I will say that it's pretty easy to find these files online, so good luck with that. Once you get past that initial hurdle, you'll find Delta to be a fairly optimized and simple to use emulator. And that's where I think this emulator excels, in its sheer simplicity. You simply locate your ROMs, and then Delta will create an icon and box art for each game. Although some games don't get box art, and this has to do with not using the proper naming convention. In clicking on a game, you'll be loaded into it pretty much immediately, meaning that from the home screen, you can be in any game within 2 clicks, or taps. Delta starts you off with this pink touch overlay that contains all of the DS buttons, and if you're not familiar with emulation on mobile devices, these overlays are how they account for a touch device with no buttons. There's an extra menu button that allows you to pause the game and access some of the emulator's extra features. It also lets you go back to the main menu and switch to a different game. By default, you only get this pink overlay, but if you look them up, you can actually download more of them. Just type in Delta DS skins, and you can see some of the options they have here. From here, you can download them directly from your iOS device and access them that way. If touch controls aren't your thing, you can also connect a Bluetooth controller. This will automatically hide the touch overlay and map the menu button to one of your controller's buttons. In my case, the Xbox button, but you can switch it to any button you want. You'll find that all the controls are already mapped to your controller, but you are able to customize them to your heart's desire. One downside here though is that you can't map a DS button to multiple of your actual controller's buttons. For example, you can't have the DS D-pad be mapped to both your controller's D-pad and left stick. What you can do though is map your hotkeys to the controller, and thankfully fast forward is toggleable. When it comes to screens, this is where I think we'll find this emulator to be the most limited. There are no integer scaling or screen size options, so you're stuck with whatever screen size your overlay has. You'll find that some of these overlays make the screen smaller, while others make them larger. There are only two screen layouts here as well, horizontal and vertical. Vertical works pretty great on an iPhone as you get an insane amount of screen real estate, while horizontal is too small to play on. You won't find any screen gap settings here either, and this is almost a deal breaker for me, as you'll know how bothered I am by having the top and bottom screens hug each other like this. To top it off, you can't upscale your image either, so you're stuck playing on the original resolution. If you're on an iPhone, then this doesn't matter at all, as DS games look great here. It's almost as if these games were meant to be played on a device like this, especially considering the OLED screen here. You get a really nice image, and you really just have to be in front of it to appreciate it. If you download the buttonless NDS overlay, you can get rid of all the extra overlay mumbo and just get your two screens and menu button. Then you'll notice that the screens here are pretty much the same size as they are in a real DS. This gets me into what I really like about DS games on the iPhone. I like to play games here with minimal to no button requirements. Games that are pretty much played entirely with the touchscreen, such as Chrono Trigger, Zelda Phantom Hourglass, Picross, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, and WarioWare Touched. These titles really have a mobile game feel and are way better than most mobile games. Although we do need to consider that this is only possible on Delta by using the overlay that hides everything else. Meaning that if your game requires you to occasionally press a button, you'll need to go all the way back to the main menu to switch to a different overlay. Now later we will see how we can remedy this. Moving over to the iPad, you'll notice that our screens here are scaled up significantly, and the lower resolution doesn't look as good here. In all honesty, it doesn't really feel like the app was designed with the iPad in mind. I say this because the main menu here doesn't even take up the entire iPad screen. It's just one of those iPhone apps that can also run on the iPad. You can't even get rid of this top bar here, so that kind of breaks the immersion too. The iPad does have one really good thing going for it, however, and that's the Apple Pencil. This is a really nice stylus with a great weighted feel. This thing is way better than a DS stylus, although the iPad does not have a resistive touchscreen, so the experience will be different. I've been playing Zelda Phantom Hourglass with this method, and it's honestly better than on the original hardware. The iPad's large screen gives you a lot of screen space here to really pull off the gestures this game requires. Another one I really like it in is Picross DS, as the Apple Pencil and large screen really help you be accurate in this game. So what extra features does Delta have? Well, you have your standard save states here, and you can make multiple of them. In addition to this, you also get a great autosave feature that pretty much creates a save state for you every time you close the app. So if you accidentally close it or something, you're safe. Or maybe you're just lazy and want to exit the app without losing your progress. You also have your fast forward, cheats, and hold button. Hold button is here to make platformers easier, as you can always have it hold the run button for you. I mean, I kind of just hold the B button, and when I want to jump, I slide my finger to the A button, but this works too. Overall, Delta is great for its simplicity, as other emulators can be really overwhelming. I'd go with it if you're still more of a beginner when it comes to all this emulation stuff. Now, Delta isn't the only option when it comes to emulating DS games on iOS devices. Available on the App Store now as well is Retroarch. Yeah, this is unbelievable. Never did I think the day would come when we would be able to download Retroarch on an iOS device. And I'll tell you right off the bat that Retroarch is going to be the way to go here if you want to emulate these games with the full list of features. We got stuff like upscaling, integer scaling, multiple screen layouts, screen gap settings, being able to map your controller to use the touchscreen, and all the other features you'd expect from Retroarch. On the iPad, you also don't get the ugly bar at the top, and when playing on the iPhone, you have a button that hides the button overlay. This solves the problem we talked about earlier and is the way to go for those touch-based DS games, as you can quickly bring up your overlay for whenever you do need to press a button. Now, Retroarch isn't for everyone, however, as it's so damn clunky and has somewhat of a learning curve. I mean, there's so many settings, like how do you even figure out what everything does? Also, I'm not the biggest fan of the menus here when playing on iOS. Usually for Retroarch, I use XMB, which works great, but it's not the best on a touchscreen. You kind of just have to stick to their default menu, which does feel a bit confusing. Retroarch also doesn't feel as fast as Delta. You do need to go through more of the menu to get to a game or access any given setting. Despite this, I still think Retroarch is the way to go when emulating on iOS. It just has so many features that are hard to live without, and it's incredible that you can experience this on an Apple device. DS emulation is probably the best it's ever been. There are clearly tons of ways to emulate DS games, and I'm sure you'll notice that Android phones weren't covered in this video. I unfortunately don't own an Android phone at the time, but if there is enough interest, I'd be willing to get one just to test this out. Now hopefully you're not finding all of these emulation options overwhelming. There's no true king here, as each method has one thing that the others don't. To conclude, I do want to say one good thing about each emulation method. PC emulation with Desmume has to be the most robust, as it has every option you could want and gives you that flash game feel. Retroarch is the best when it comes to playing on the TV. Wii U emulation honestly sucks, but it was provided by Nintendo, and what the heck do they know about emulating? Playing on the 3DS probably gives you the most authentic experience out of any method here. And emulation on an iPhone is just so damn convenient. Like, when don't I have my phone with me? I never really think to take my DS with me when leaving my house, but my iPhone, I got it all the time and I can just take it out whenever. Lastly, the iPad, because the Apple Pencil. That's it. I think this proves my point though, that there's something here for everybody. This is a truly wacky console and almost impossible to fully recreate, although I do think we can get pretty close and even improve upon the experience. With that said, if you made it this far into the video, I do thank you because I put a lot of work and research into this one. And yeah, I'm back. It's been a while, but I'm back. Thank you everybody for watching.